France did not send an army. No columns of armored vehicles crossed borders. No new bases were announced. No flags were raised. And yet, when an attempted coup shook Benin, the outcome was decided with remarkable speed. The intervention was real, but almost invisible. There were no televised briefings from Paris, no dramatic declarations of resolve. Instead, there were surveillance flights, intelligence shared in quiet rooms, logistics arranged behind closed doors, and a small, carefully chosen group of specialists moved without spectacle. This was not the France Africa had grown used to. For decades, French power on the continent was unmistakable. Large bases, thousands of troops, direct military action, justified as stability, criticized as domination, presence was visible, and increasingly contested. That era is ending. Today, France is rewriting its playbook, not retreating but recalibrating, trading footprints for shadows, substituting force with positioning, choosing when to act, and, just as importantly, when not to be seen acting at all. Nowhere is this shift clearer than in the Sahel. In countries like Burkina Faso, French influence has collapsed outright, rejected by new leaders and new narratives. Figures such as Ibrahim Traoré have come to symbolize a decisive break from Paris's old security architecture, turning the Sahel into a space France can no longer control directly. So Paris adapts. Stay with us. Because France's power in Africa did not disappear. It learned how to hide. This story is about what happens when an old power loses its center of gravity and responds not with force but with finesse. About a continent where influence is no longer measured by how many troops you deploy, but by where, when, and through whom you choose to act. Because in today's Africa, the loudest power is often no longer the most effective one. The coup attempt in Benin did not last long. Within hours, it collapsed under the weight of a coordinated response. Government control was restored, the mutiny dissolved, and the country stepped back from the edge without descending into chaos. What stood out was not only the speed of the outcome, but the absence of spectacle. There were no French battalions on the streets, no emergency broadcasts from Paris, no announcement of a new operation. Yet the response was decisive. Behind the scenes, France moved differently. Surveillance assets were activated. Intelligence flowed through established channels. Logistics were aligned with regional partners. A small number of specialists were quietly repositioned from a nearby base, not to fight openly, but to support, advise, and enable. This was intervention, stripped of visibility. For Benin, the assistance arrived without the political cost that once accompanied French involvement. There was no image of foreign troops saving the state, no narrative of dependence. Instead, the response was framed as regional, with Nigeria and ECOWAS at the forefront, while France remained in the background, influential but unobtrusive. That positioning was intentional. Paris understood the optics. In today's West Africa, presence can provoke resistance faster than it restores order. The memory of large-scale interventions and the resentment they generated still lingers across the Sahel and beyond. So France chose to act without claiming the stage. The tools were precise. The footprint was minimal. The timing was exact. This approach allowed Paris to shape the outcome without owning it publicly. Benin's government retained legitimacy. Regional actors led visibly. And France avoided becoming the symbol around which opposition could rally. The contrast with earlier decades could not be sharper. Once, French strategy relied on permanence, bases, troops, and a constant show of capability. Stability was enforced through visibility. Influence was measured by presence. In Benin, the opposite logic applied. Influence came from discretion. The crisis was resolved not through overwhelming force, but through alignment of information, coordination, and timing. France did not dictate events. It synchronized with them. This was the new trigger moment, because Benin revealed how Paris now prefers to operate, stepping in just enough to matter, but never enough to dominate the narrative, supporting allies while allowing them to appear fully sovereign, acting decisively yet leaving no obvious fingerprints behind. The coup attempt became the perfect case study. It showed that France no longer needs to be seen to be effective, that power, when exercised quietly, can travel further and face less resistance, and that in a region wary of old hierarchies, invisibility can be an asset rather than a weakness. But this also raised a deeper question. If France is no longer intervening openly, if its role is increasingly hidden, selective and indirect, what does that mean for the balance of power across Africa? Because what happened in Benin was not an exception. It was a signal. And to understand that signal, we must look back to the old order France is now leaving behind. To understand what changed, we must first remember what came before. For decades, France's presence in Africa was anything but discreet. It was visible, permanent, and unmistakable. Military bases dotted the map. Thousands of troops were stationed across the continent. Interventions were announced, named, and broadcast to the world. Power was exercised in full view. In the Sahel, this approach reached its peak. French forces operated openly, leading counter-terrorism campaigns, patrolling vast territories, and positioning themselves as the indispensable guarantor of security. Stability was framed as something that required constant oversight, and France provided it directly. This model rested on three pillars. First, permanence. Large bases signaled commitment and deterrence. They were meant to reassure allies and warn adversaries that France was staying. Second, visibility. French involvement was explicit. Operations carried French names. Command structures were French-led. Success and failure alike were publicly owned. Third, authority. Paris did not merely support local forces. It often set the tempo, defined objectives, and shaped the narrative of security itself. For a time, this worked. Governments relied on French firepower. Regional organizations deferred to French capability. And international partners treated Paris as the primary Western actor in the Sahel. But the costs accumulated. Visibility bred resentment. Bases became symbols, not of protection, but of intrusion. Military operations, however tactically sophisticated, failed to deliver the political stability they promised. And over time, the line between partnership and dependence blurred in ways that proved corrosive. Public opinion shifted. What had once been accepted as security assistance was reinterpreted as domination. Protests grew, narratives hardened, and military leaders who seized power in the Sahel learned that opposing France carried domestic political value. Nowhere was this clearer than in Burkina Faso. As new authorities consolidated control, French forces were no longer welcomed as stabilizers. They were portrayed as relics of an outdated order, one that had failed to secure the region while constraining sovereignty. Calls for withdrawal intensified, and Paris found itself pushed out of spaces it had long considered central. Figures like Ibrahim Traoré became emblematic of this rupture, not simply because they demanded France's departure, but because they reframed the entire security relationship. The argument was no longer about effectiveness alone. It was about dignity, agency, and who had the right to define threats and solutions. This was the moment the old order broke. France's model of direct military presence, once its greatest asset, became its greatest liability. Bases turned into bargaining chips. Troops became targets of political mobilization. And the very visibility that once projected strength now amplified backlash. Paris faced a choice: persist and risk deeper isolation, or adapt and accept a diminished but more sustainable role. The withdrawals that followed were not tactical redeployments. They were acknowledgements that the era of overt dominance had ended, that the Sahel could no longer be managed through the same instruments, nor justified by the same language. What France lost was not simply territory. It lost its center of gravity. And when an old strategy collapses, what replaces it is rarely announced with fanfare. It emerges quietly through trial, recalibration, and selective engagement. That is why the shift matters. Because the France that once led with troops and bases is no longer the France shaping outcomes today. The old order taught Paris a hard lesson. In a region, redefining sovereignty, being everywhere can mean belonging nowhere. and that lesson set the stage for a different kind of strategy, one built not on permanence, but on precision. The change did not come with a declaration, it arrived through absence. As French bases closed and troops departed, Paris did not announce a retreat from Africa. Instead, it allowed a different reality to take shape, one where influence was no longer measured by how many soldiers stood on the ground, but by how outcomes were shaped without them. This was the pivot. France shifted from presence to positioning, from occupation to orchestration, from footprints to shadows. In practical terms, the tools changed. Large formations gave way to intelligence cells. Fixed bases were replaced by access agreements. Command structures flattened into coordination networks that could be activated when needed and disappear just as quickly. Where once France led openly, it now enabled discreetly. This evolution was not ideological. It was forced. The Sahel had become politically hostile terrain. In places like Burkina Faso, French forces were no longer welcome, not because they had vanished, but because they were too visible for too long. New leaders framed sovereignty as incompatible with foreign boots on national soil. Figures such as Ibrahim Traoré did not merely expel French troops. They rejected the entire grammar of security that those troops represented. Presence itself became the problem. Paris learned from this. Rather than contest the narrative head-on, France changed the script. It reduced exposure. It avoided symbolism. It embedded itself where legitimacy remained, within partnerships that invited support rather than resisted it. Benin illustrated the new method perfectly. France did not claim leadership. It did not brand an operation. It did not place itself at the center of the response. Instead, it supplied what others lacked: intelligence, coordination, and timing. And then step back. This is shadow power. It operates through access, not authority. Through relationships, not commands. Through precision, not permanence. The advantage is obvious. Discretion lowers political cost. It limits backlash. It allows Paris to remain relevant even in spaces where overt presence would provoke resistance. But it also carries a trade-off. Shadow power depends on alignment. It requires willing partners. It cannot compel cooperation in the way force once could. And when relationships fray, influence fades quickly. This is why the shift matters beyond France. It signals a broader transformation in how external powers operate in Africa. The era of open-ended military guardianship is closing. In its place emerges a model that privileges flexibility over control and discretion over dominance. Yet shadows cannot replace substance indefinitely. They are effective in moments of crisis, but fragile over time. They shape outcomes without owning them, which can preserve stability, but also dilute responsibility. France has accepted this ambiguity. It no longer seeks to be the visible guarantor of order. It seeks to be the quiet variable that tips the balance when conditions allow. A power present without appearing permanent. The Sahel forced this adaptation, Benin revealed its application, and together they mark the emergence of a French strategy that does not aim to reclaim what was lost, but to remain influential in a continent where visibility has become a liability. The question now is not whether France can operate from the shadows, it is whether shadows will be enough. Because in regions slipping beyond direct control, influence must travel further and endure longer than ever before. The shift in France's strategy has altered the nature of competition across Africa, not by ending rivalry, but by changing how it is fought. As overt military confrontation recedes, influence now moves through quieter channels. Intelligence partnerships, logistics corridors, diplomatic timing. The contest has become less visible, but no less consequential. For Paris, this transformation reduces immediate friction. By avoiding the spotlight, France lowers the political temperature. It no longer stands as the obvious antagonist in regions where anti-foreign sentiment runs high. Confrontation fades, at least on the surface. But beneath that calm, competition intensifies. Because when power is exercised discreetly, it becomes harder to track, harder to challenge, and harder to balance. States do not respond to speeches or troop movements. They respond to outcomes: who stabilized the crisis, who gained access, who shaped the response without being named. This is the paradox of the new strategy. France appears less dominant, yet remains strategically relevant. It no longer controls territory, but it influences moments. It does not define regional order, but it can tilt it selectively. For African governments, this creates a more ambiguous environment. On one hand, the reduction of overt foreign presence offers political breathing space. Leaders can claim sovereignty without confronting visible bases or permanent deployments. The optics improve. On the other hand, discretion blurs accountability. When influence operates behind the scenes, responsibility becomes diffuse. Decisions feel local, but pressures are external. Support arrives quietly, but expectations follow. Nowhere is this tension sharper than along the fault line between the Sahel and the coastal states. With France largely absent from the Sahel's core, that region has become less accessible, but not irrelevant, to Paris. Influence now approaches from the edges, through partners willing to cooperate, through crises that demand rapid alignment. This edge-based strategy changes regional dynamics. Sahelian governments see it as circumvention, coastal governments see it as reassurance. Both readings fuel mistrust. As a result, the region drifts toward indirect rivalry, not armies facing each other, but networks competing for alignment, not declarations of hostility, but preemptive positioning. The danger here is subtle escalation. When competition is quiet, misinterpretation becomes easier. A technical decision can be read as a political signal. A logistical choice can appear strategic. And because confrontation is no longer explicit, grievances accumulate without release. This environment favors those with patience and reach. France has both, but it also carries risk. By operating discreetly, Paris limits backlash, yet also limits influence over long-term trajectories. It can shape responses, but not always outcomes. It can assist partners, but cannot compel them. Its power is conditional, not absolute. That conditionality defines the new phase. Open confrontation has given way to selective competition. Control has been replaced by leverage, and the battlefield has shifted from territory to timing. The Sahel, once the center of French strategy, now sits largely beyond direct reach. What remains is a perimeter approach, managing instability without claiming ownership of it. This may be sustainable, or it may simply postpone a reckoning, because competition that is never acknowledged rarely resolves itself. It hardens quietly, waiting for a moment when discretion is no longer enough. And when that moment arrives, the question will not be whether France can still act. It will be whether acting from the shadows can still shape a region whose balance is already tilting away. Every strategic retreat creates a vacuum, and vacuums invite questions. France's shift away from overt military presence has reduced friction, but it has not resolved the central dilemma: how to remain influential in a region where direct control is no longer viable, yet this engagement carries its own costs. The first risk is strategic marginalization. By operating discreetly, Paris lowers visibility, but also risks fading from the calculations that shape long-term outcomes. Influence exercised only in moments of crisis may stabilize situations temporarily, but it rarely determines trajectories. Over time, others begin to set the agenda. In the Sahel, that process is already underway. New security partnerships are forming, alternative patrons are testing the ground, and local authorities, having expelled visible foreign forces, are asserting narratives of autonomy that leave little room for quiet return. The second risk is dependency on proxies. A strategy built on partners requires partners who remain aligned. Political transitions, leadership changes, or shifts in public opinion can quickly erode access. When influence flows through others, it becomes hostage to their priorities. Discretion, in this sense, trades control for permission. Yet the alternative, a return to overt presence, carries even greater danger. Any attempt by France to re-enter the Sahel in visible form would likely trigger immediate resistance. Memories of past operations remain vivid. Narratives of rejection are entrenched. What once passed as security assistance would now be framed as provocation. Paris understands this, which is why the horizon does not point toward dramatic comeback, but toward a subtler evolution. Rather than returning to the Sahel directly, France may continue to orbit it, operating from the edges, leveraging intelligence networks, coordinating through regional organizations, influencing outcomes without claiming ownership. This perimeter strategy accepts a hard truth. Some spaces cannot be reclaimed without cost exceeding benefit, but it also leaves open a question of endurance. Can influence sustained from a distance survive prolonged instability? Can shadows shape environments that demand constant presence? And can a power accustomed to leading accept a role defined by limitation? The answers will not come quickly. What is clear is that France's future role in Africa will be neither what it once was, nor what its critics fear most. It will be smaller, quieter, and more conditional, but not irrelevant. The Sahel may remain beyond Paris's direct reach, yet it will continue to matter. Not as a theater of operations, but as a reference point, a reminder of where old strategies failed and where new ones are being tested under constraint. France's horizon, then, is not about return. It is about adaptation, about learning to operate without dominance, to accept influence without control, and to recognize that in a continent redefining sovereignty, the most durable power may be the one that knows when not to insist. Whether that restraint proves sufficient will shape France's place in Africa for decades to come. Because the question is no longer whether France can act, it is whether acting less and acting differently will be enough. France did not abandon Africa. It abandoned a way of being powerful. What the events in Benin revealed was not a return of the French dominance, but the quiet emergence of a different doctrine, one shaped by constraint, rejection, and hard-earned adaptation. Paris no longer leads with visibility. It leads with timing. This is power without parade, influence without ownership, presence without permanence. For France, this strategy is born of a necessity. The Sahel, once the centerpiece of its African security vision, has moved beyond direct reach. In places like Burkina Faso, the old language of partnership collapsed under the weight of resentment and unmet promises. Leaders, such as Ibrahim Traoré, did not merely push French troops out, they closed the door on an entire era. Rather than force it open, Paris stepped aside. But stepping aside did not mean stepping away. By shifting toward discreet support, selective engagement, and edge-based influence, France has chosen survival over symbolism. It now intervenes where it is invited, assists without dominating, and shapes outcomes while letting others take credit. This approach lowers resistance, but it also lowers certainty. Shadow influence is effective in moments of crisis, yet fragile over time. It depends on trust, alignment, and access, all of which can vanish overnight. France can no longer compel cooperation. It must earn it, crisis by crisis. For Africa, this marks a turning point. External power is no longer measured by how loudly it speaks, but by how quietly it moves. The continent is no longer a stage for grand interventions, but a terrain of selective alignments and negotiated influence. The Sahel, meanwhile, remains unresolved, not conquered, not reclaimed, but watched from a distance. It stands as both warning and reference point, proof that control can be lost and that adaptation may be the only path forward. France's new strategy does not promise dominance. It promises relevance. Whether that will be enough, in a region increasingly defined by sovereign assertion and competing influences, remains uncertain. But one thing is clear. The age of overt command has ended. The era of discreet contest has begun. And in this quieter struggle, the most decisive power may belong not to those who arrive loudly, but to those who know how to act without being seen. This is not France's return to Africa. It is France learning how to stay without insisting.